The howling wind rattled the windows of the stage coach office as Lillian Whitaker clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, desperation etching deeper lines into her pale face with each passing minute. It was December 1887, and the brutal winter that had descended upon Fort McDowell, Arizona territory, seemed determined to match the coldness of her husband's heart. "I'm telling you, madam, he paid for one ticket east, just one," the station master repeated, genuine sympathy in his weathered face. "Said nothing about you following. Left on yesterday's coach before the storm hit." Lillian's knees weakened as the final thread of hope snapped. George had truly abandoned her, taking their savings and leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the wedding ring that now felt like a mockery on her finger. She'd suspected his affections had cooled over their 2-year marriage, but never imagined he would simply vanish, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note. "Found better prospects, don't follow." "Might be for the best, madam," the station master offered awkwardly. "Pardon my saying so, but a man who'd leave his wife to face winter alone ain't worth the leather of his boots." Lillian nodded numbly, her mind racing. The boarding house where they'd stayed had already rented their room to a traveling salesman when George failed to return last night. Her meager possessions had been set outside their door: a carpet bag containing a spare dress, a hairbrush, and a worn photograph of her parents, long dead now. "Is there somewhere in town I might find work?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. At 24, she was no stranger to hardship, but George had swept her away from her position as a schoolteacher in Missouri with promises of adventure and prosperity in the West. The station master scratched his graying beard. "Town's struggling this winter, madam. The mines laid off half their men and folks are leaving, not coming." He hesitated. "There's the saloon, but—" Lillian stiffened. "Thank you, but I'll find something suitable." 3 hours later, as the afternoon light faded and the temperature plummeted further, Lillian had faced rejection at every establishment in Fort McDowell's modest business district. The general store had no need for help. The hotel was letting staff go, not hiring. The seamstress had barely enough work for herself. As darkness fell, so did the snow-thick, heavy flakes that quickly blanketed the ground. Lillian stumbled through the accumulating drifts, her thin boots soaked through, fingers numb inside her inadequate gloves. She'd used the last of her coins for a bowl of stew at the hotel restaurant, hoping to stay warm inside as long as possible. But eventually, the sympathetic waitress had to ask her to leave as they closed for the night. Fort McDowell's streets emptied as sensible folks hurried to their warm homes. Lillian tried to ignore the panic rising in her chest. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she had nowhere to go. Pride had kept her from accepting the waitress's hesitant suggestion that the saloon might offer a room in exchange for serving drinks. "I'll manage," Lillian whispered to herself, though her voice was swallowed by the howling wind. The small church at the edge of town might offer sanctuary, but it stood dark and locked when she reached it, the minister having departed for a larger parish months ago. Beyond the church lay only open country, rolling hills and scattered ranches. Walking out there in this weather would be foolish, possibly fatal. Yet staying in town with no shelter seemed equally dangerous. As the cold deepened its grip on her body, desperation drove her forward. She'd heard there was a ranch not far beyond town. Perhaps they would have work, or at least allow her to sleep in a stable until morning. One foot in front of the other, she fought the intensifying storm, the wind cutting through her clothing like knives of ice. Time lost meaning as Lillian battled forward. Her thoughts grew sluggish, and a dangerous drowsiness began to overtake her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered reading that falling asleep in such cold meant death, yet her body craved rest with overwhelming intensity. When she stumbled and fell into a snowdrift, the temporary relief from the wind felt almost pleasant. Just a moment's rest, she told herself, knowing even as consciousness began to slip away that she was making a fatal mistake. Through the curtain of swirling snow, Lillian thought she glimpsed a light distant, wavering. Probably just her mind playing tricks, offering one last false hope before the cold claimed her completely. Her eyes drifted closed. The sound came first, the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow, followed by a sharp voice cutting through the howling wind. Then strong hands gripped her shoulders, shaking her roughly. "Madam, madam, open your eyes." Lillian forced her heavy eyelids open to find herself looking up into the concerned face of a man mid-30s perhaps, his features partially hidden beneath a snow-dusted hat and scarf. "Can't stay here," he said gruffly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You'll freeze to death." "Can you stand?" When Lillian tried and failed to rise, the stranger muttered something under his breath and lifted her in one fluid motion. She felt herself being placed on a horse. Then the man swung up behind her, one arm securing her against his chest. "Hold on," he instructed, guiding the horse forward through the blinding snow. Lillian wanted to ask where they were going, wanted to protest being handled by a stranger, but her frozen lips couldn't form the words, and her body was beyond resistance. They rode for what seemed an eternity through the storm, the stranger occasionally checking that she remained conscious by speaking sharply when her head drooped. Finally, a building loomed through the whiteout, a sturdy cabin with light spilling from its windows. "We're here," the man said, dismounting and lifting her down. He half carried her to the cabin door, kicking it open and bringing her inside to a rush of blessed warmth. The interior was simple but comfortable. A large fireplace blazed along one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and a bed stood in one corner. Various tools and ranching equipment hung from hooks, and shelves held supplies and a few books. "Let's get you warmed up before you lose fingers or toes," the man said, setting her in a chair close to the fire. He removed his snow-covered hat and coat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples and piercing blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. Lillian tried to thank him, but her teeth chattered too violently for speech. "Name's Gabe Blackett," he said, pouring something from a pot hanging near the fire into a mug. "Most folks call me Gabe. Ranch is about 5 miles outside Fort McDowell." "What in God's name were you doing out in this blizzard?" Lillian's stiff fingers struggled with her frozen boots until Gabe knelt and helped remove them, revealing alarmingly white toes. He frowned and immediately began to rub them gently, restoring circulation with practiced movements. "You're lucky," he said after a moment. "No frostbite yet, but it was close." He pressed the warm mug into her hands. "Drink this, just broth, but it'll help." As feeling painfully returned to her extremities, Lillian managed to sip the hot liquid, its warmth spreading through her core. "Thank you," she finally whispered. "I'm Lillian Whitaker." "What happened to you, Mrs. Whitaker?" Gabe asked, his voice gentler now that immediate danger had passed. "Where's Mr. Whitaker?" The simple question unleashed the emotion Lillian had been holding at bay. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she explained her situation in halting sentences: George's abandonment, her desperate search for work, and finally, her ill-advised journey into the storm. Gabe listened without interruption, his expression hardening when she described her husband's desertion. When she finished, he rose and added wood to the already blazing fire. "Some men don't deserve the title," he said flatly. "You'll stay here tonight. Storm's too bad to go anywhere else and you need proper rest." "I couldn't impose," Lillian began weakly. "It's not imposing when the alternative is death," Gabe cut her off. "I've got a small back room where I keep supplies. I'll sleep there. You take the bed." Too exhausted to argue, Lillian nodded gratefully. "I'll find work tomorrow when the storm clears. Pay you back somehow." Gabe waved off her words and moved to a trunk, extracting a clean flannel shirt and wool socks. "Change into these. Your clothes are soaked through. I'll step outside to check on my horse." When he returned several minutes later, Lillian had changed into his offered clothing. The shirt hung to her knees and she'd rolled up the sleeves numerous times, but she felt warmer than she had in days. Her own dress and undergarments hung near the fire to dry. Gabe nodded approvingly and set about preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits from the morning. They ate in relative silence, Lillian too overwhelmed by the day's events to make conversation, and Gabe seemingly comfortable without idle talk. After eating, exhaustion hit Lillian like a physical force. Gabe noticed immediately and gestured toward the bed. Rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out. Despite her unfamiliar surroundings and the presence of a stranger, Lillian fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost instantly, warmed by the fire and the first kindness she'd experienced in longer than she cared to remember. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows and the scent of coffee brewing. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't recall where she was then. The previous day's events came rushing back. Sitting up quickly, she found Gabe already dressed and moving about the cabin. "Storm's past," he said by way of greeting, nodding toward the window where brilliant sunshine reflected off pristine snow. "But we got nearly 2 feet. Town'll be digging out for days." Lillian rose, suddenly conscious of her state of dress in this stranger's home. Her own clothes, now dry, were folded neatly on a chair near the bed. "I should get dressed and be on my way. You've been more than kind." Gabe poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "No rush. Roads won't be passable until afternoon at the earliest." He handed her a cup. "Besides, we need to talk about your situation." Lillian accepted the coffee gratefully. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackett, but I'll manage." "Gabe," he corrected. "And with respect, Mrs. Whitaker, you nearly died last night." Fort McDowell isn't exactly brimming with opportunities for a woman alone, especially in winter. His bluntness stung, but Lillian couldn't deny the truth of his words. She sipped her coffee, buying time as she considered her limited options. "I was a teacher before I married," she said finally. "I could perhaps find a position. School closed last month," Gabe interrupted. "Not enough children left after the mine cut back operations." Lillian's shoulders slumped. "I see." Gabe leaned against the table, studying her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. "I have a proposition. It's not charity, mind you, I need the help." Lillian raised an eyebrow, instantly wary. Her experience with men's propositions since arriving in the West had taught her caution. Reading her expression, Gabe shook his head. "Nothing improper. I run this ranch alone since my hand left for California last fall. It's small, but there's plenty that needs doing: cooking, mending, keeping accounts. I can offer room, board, and a modest wage until spring, when the stage runs more regularly and you can decide where to go next." The offer was unexpected and surprisingly tempting. Lillian studied the man before her, tall and lean, with the hard, muscled build of someone who worked from sunrise to sunset. His face was weathered but not unkind, and his eyes held a directness that suggested honesty. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked. Gabe shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with the question. "Been in tough spots myself. Besides, good help is hard to find, and I reckon you need work as much as I need help." It wasn't charity, she realized, or at least, he was careful not to frame it that way. The arrangement would benefit them both. "I accept," Lillian said, decision made, "but I insist on proper terms. I'll work for my keep, not accept handouts." A faint smile touched Gabe's lips. "Wouldn't have offered otherwise." He extended his hand to seal their agreement, and after a slight hesitation, Lillian shook it. "Now get dressed and I'll show you around," he said, turning to give her privacy. "Got a lot of ground to cover." Over the next several days, Lillian settled into life at Gabe's ranch. The property was modest by Arizona standards, about 80 acres with a small herd of cattle, 2 horses, and a few chickens. The cabin, while basic, was sturdily built and surprisingly comfortable once she applied her organizational skills to its bachelor-maintained interior. Gabe proved to be a fair employer, explaining tasks clearly and acknowledging work well done with brief nods that she quickly recognized as high praise from the taciturn rancher. He was gone from dawn until dusk most days, tending to cattle and repairing fences damaged in the storm. Lillian filled her days with cooking, cleaning, and mending Gabe's woefully neglected clothing. She discovered a talent for ranch bookkeeping, bringing order to the haphazard records he kept in an old ledger. In the evenings, they shared quiet meals by the fire, initially with little conversation beyond the necessities of planning the next day's work. Gradually, however, the silences grew comfortable rather than awkward. Lillian found herself watching Gabe when he wasn't looking, the careful precision of his movements, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. He was nothing like George, who had charmed her with flowery words and grand promises he never intended to keep. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Gabe returned from town with supplies and an unexpected package. "For you," he said gruffly, handing her a paper-wrapped parcel. "Figured you might need it." Curious, Lillian unwrapped the package to find a warm wool coat, practical but well-made, with a matching scarf and gloves. Emotion tightened her throat at this unexpected thoughtfulness. "I can't accept this," she protested weakly, even as her fingers stroked the soft wool. "Already took it from your wages," Gabe replied, though she suspected from his averted gaze that he wasn't being entirely truthful. "Can't have you freezing if you need to go outside, just practical." Lillian smiled, recognizing that arguing would only embarrass him further. "Thank you." "It's perfect." That night, as they sat by the fire, the barriers between them seemed to lower slightly. Gabe spoke of his journey west from Pennsylvania 15 years earlier, following the death of his parents. He'd worked as a cowhand on various ranches before saving enough to purchase this land 5 years ago. "Never expected to be a rancher," he admitted, staring into the flames. "Father was a blacksmith, thought I'd follow him in the trade. Life has other ideas sometimes." "Indeed it does," Lillian agreed softly, thinking of her own unexpected path. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a country doctor who believed in educating girls as well as boys. How she taught in the local school until meeting George, a traveling salesman who painted pictures of adventure and prosperity in the booming West. "Fool that I was, I believed every word," she concluded bitterly. "Left everything familiar for a dream that turned to dust." Gabe's eyes, reflecting the firelight, held no judgment. "Believing in someone isn't foolish, Mrs. Whitaker. The fault lies with him, not you." "Lillian, please," she corrected. "After all this time, Mrs. Whitaker seems rather formal." She hesitated. "Besides, I'm not certain I have any right to that name anymore." "Lillian, then," Gabe agreed, and something in the way he said her name made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. As January progressed into February, the bitter cold maintained its grip on the territory. But inside the cabin, warmth grew beyond that provided by the constantly maintained fire. Lillian found herself looking forward to Gabe's return each evening, and the evenings themselves stretched longer as their conversations deepened. She learned that beneath his reserved exterior lay a thoughtful mind that devoured books during the long winter nights. His small collection of volumes became a shared treasure, and they began reading aloud to each other after supper poetry, adventure stories, even philosophical treatises that sparked surprisingly spirited debates. For his part, Gabe seemed to relax in her presence, his rare smiles becoming more frequent, his gruff manner softening. He took to bringing her small gifts from his rides around the property: an unusually shaped rock, a hawk feather, wildflowers that somehow survived in sheltered spots despite the cold. One frigid morning, Lillian was kneading bread dough when a commotion outside drew her attention. Looking through the window, she saw Gabe struggling with a newborn calf, attempting to lead both it and its mother toward the small barn where he kept the most vulnerable animals during the worst weather. Without hesitation, Lillian donned her new coat and hurried outside. The bitter cold took her breath away, but she pushed forward through the snow to Gabe's side. "What can I do?" she called over the wind. Surprise flashed across his face, followed by something like admiration. Hold the mother's lead rope, I'll carry the calf. Working together, they managed to get both animals settled in the relative warmth of the barn. The calf, born prematurely, looked worryingly weak. He likely won't make it, Gabe said, his voice matter of fact but tinged with the resignation of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of ranch life. Mother's not producing enough milk, and he's too small for this weather. Lillian studied the trembling calf, something in her rebelling against accepting its fate so easily. Perhaps we could try something. My father once saved a calf by feeding it warmed goat's milk with molasses and egg. Gabe looked skeptical but nodded. Worth trying. Got no goat's milk, but the chickens are still laying. Could use cow's milk from another mother. For the next 3 days, they took turns feeding the calf, warming the barn with extra hay and a carefully monitored lantern. Lillian spent hours sitting beside the small animal, coaxing it to drink from a rag soaked in the milk mixture. Gabe watched her determination with growing respect, adjusting his own chores to allow time for the calf's care. On the 4th morning, when they entered the barn together, the calf struggled to its feet and wobbled toward them, clearly stronger. "Well, I'll be damned," Gabe said softly, genuine wonder in his voice. "You saved him." "We saved him," Lillian corrected, unexpectedly moved by the sight of the calf's recovery. Gabe turned to her, his expression open in a way she hadn't seen before. "You're a remarkable woman, Lillian Whitaker." Something in his gaze made her breath catch. For a charged moment, they stood facing each other in the dim light of the barn, the air between them seeming to crackle with unspoken feelings. Then the calf butted against Gabe's leg, breaking the spell, and the moment passed. As February progressed, Lillian became increasingly aware of her changing feelings toward Gabe. What had begun as gratitude had evolved into respect, then friendship, and now, something more complicated that she was afraid to name. She told herself it was merely the natural result of their isolated situation. 2 people alone, in a remote cabin through a harsh winter, would naturally develop a connection. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when their hands accidentally touched, or how she found herself watching for his return each day with increasing anticipation. These reactions troubled her. Her judgment with men had proven disastrously flawed once already, and besides, she was still legally married, however abandoned. For his part, Gabe maintained a careful distance, unfailingly respectful despite their intimate living arrangements. If he felt anything beyond employer-employee regard, he kept it well hidden behind his reserved demeanor. Yet sometimes, she caught him watching her with an intensity that suggested otherwise. One evening in late February, as they sat reading by the fire, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows. Gabe looked up from his book, frowning. "Storm's coming in faster than expected," he said, rising to check the shutters. "Barometers falling quickly." Within an hour, they were in the midst of the worst blizzard of the season. The wind howled like a living creature, finding every crack and crevice in the cabin's walls. Snow accumulated so rapidly that it began to obscure the windows entirely. "Need to check the animals," Gabe said, pulling on his heavy coat and gloves. "Make sure the barn door is secured." "I'll come with you," Lillian insisted, already reaching for her own coat. "It's too dangerous alone." Gabe looked ready to argue but nodded instead. "Stay close." Could get disoriented in seconds out there. The short walk to the barn became a battle against nature's fury. The wind drove ice particles that stung like needles against any exposed skin, and the swirling snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Gabe tied a rope around both their waists, anchoring them together as they struggled forward. Inside the barn, they found the animals restless but safe. Working quickly, they added extra feed and checked that all was secure before preparing to return to the cabin. When they opened the barn door, however, the storm's intensity had doubled. The rope between them now seemed a flimsy precaution against the howling whiteness that had swallowed the world. "Hold tight," Gabe shouted above the wind, gripping Lillian's hand firmly as they pushed into the maelstrom. They had gone perhaps 20 feet when disaster struck. A violent gust knocked Lillian sideways, and as she stumbled, her foot plunged through a snowdrift into a hidden depression beneath. Pain lanced through her ankle as it twisted unnaturally, and she cried out, falling to her knees. Instantly, Gabe was beside her. "Can you walk?" Lillian tried to stand but collapsed as her ankle gave way. "I don't think so," she gasped, fear rising as she realized the danger of their situation. Without hesitation, Gabe scooped her into his arms and pushed forward, fighting the storm with grim determination. Lillian clung to his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder as he navigated by memory and instinct toward where the cabin should be. For a terrifying stretch of minutes, it seemed they might be lost, doomed to wander until the cold claimed them. Then Gabe's foot struck the bottom step of the cabin porch, and moments later they were inside, the door firmly latched against the storm. Gabe carried Lillian directly to the fire, setting her gently on the rug before it. His face, half frozen and reddened by wind, wore an expression of concern as he knelt to examine her ankle. "Need to remove your boot," he said, his fingers already working on the laces. "Likely to hurt." Despite his careful movements, Lillian couldn't suppress a gasp of pain as he eased the boot from her swollen ankle. Gabe's hands, so capable with horses and cattle, were surprisingly gentle as they probed the injury. "Not broken, I think," he said after a thorough examination. "Bad sprain, though. Need to wrap it tight and keep it elevated." He moved with efficient purpose, gathering supplies strips of clean cloth, a jar of salve he'd made himself from herbs and beeswax, small wooden splints. As he worked, Lillian found herself studying his face, the furrow of concentration between his brows, the firm line of his jaw, now darkened with a day's growth of beard. "You've done this before," she observed as he expertly wrapped her ankle. "Spent some time as a field medic during a skirmish with Apache raiders about 10 years back," he explained, his focus on his task. "Wasn't much of a fight, more misunderstanding than anything, but learned some useful skills." When he finished, he carefully elevated her foot on a pillow. "Should stay off it entirely for at least 2 days. After that, we'll see." "I can't just lie here while you do all the work," Lillian protested. Gabe's expression softened into one of his rare smiles. "Reckon I managed before you came, can manage a few days more." He rose and moved to the stove. Tea might help with the pain. As he prepared the tea, Lillian realized how completely their roles had reversed. Now she was the one dependent on his care, and the vulnerability of her position was both unsettling and strangely comforting. The storm raged throughout the night and well into the next day. Confined to the area near the fire, Lillian watched as Gabe moved between cabin and barn, maintaining their small world against winter's assault. He brought her books, made sure she ate, and checked her ankle regularly with professional detachment that nonetheless conveyed genuine concern. By the second night, the worst of the blizzard had passed, though snow continued to fall steadily. Gabe returned from his evening check of the animals, with frost clinging to his beard and exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. He'd been working double duty, handling all the chores Lillian normally managed along with his own. "You should rest," she told him as he wearily removed his coat. "You've barely slept." "I'm fine," he insisted, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested otherwise. Lillian patted the space beside her near the fire. "At least sit for a while. The world won't end if you take a moment for yourself." After a brief hesitation, Gabe sank down beside her, stretching his long legs toward the fire's warmth. The crackling flames cast flickering shadows across his face, softening its weathered lines. "How's the ankle?" he asked. "Better." "Less painful." Lillian shifted slightly, wincing as the movement sent a twinge through the injured joint. "Though I'm afraid I'm a poor patient. I've never been good at sitting still." "Notice that," Gabe said, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Saw you trying to reach the broom earlier. Caught, Lillian laughed. The floor needed sweeping. Floor's been there a long time, can be dirty a few more days. Their eyes met, and the smile they shared felt like a private language developing between them. Lillian became acutely aware of his proximity, of the scent of cold air and pine that clung to his clothing, of how the firelight caught golden highlights in his dark hair. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. "Not just for yesterday, but for everything. Finding me in the snow that first night, giving me work, being kind." Gabe's eyes, so often guarded, were open now, revealing emotions she couldn't quite interpret. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Lillian said firmly. "Not anyone, not my husband, certainly." The mention of George hung in the air between them, a reminder of complications neither had addressed. Gabe's expression darkened slightly. "Have you thought about what you'll do when spring comes?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. The question startled Lillian. In truth, she had been so absorbed in present survival and the growing connection between them that she'd given little thought to the future. Spring would mean passable roads, regular stage service, options beyond this isolated cabin. "I haven't decided," she admitted. "I should probably head east, try to find teaching work." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, the prospect of leaving bringing an unexpected ache to her chest. Gabe nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. "Makes sense. More opportunities for a woman of your education back east." Something in his tone made her wonder if he was thinking the same thing she was, that the idea of parting had become increasingly difficult to contemplate. "And you?" she asked. "What happens here when spring comes? Same as always. Cattle need tending, fences need mending." "Seasons change, work doesn't." The conversation lapsed into silence, but it was charged now with unspoken questions and possibilities neither seemed ready to voice. Eventually, exhaustion claimed Gabe, and he dozed off where he sat, his head gradually tilting until it rested against the wall behind them. Lillian watched him sleep. The stern lines of his face relaxed in repose, making him look younger and somehow vulnerable. An unexpected tenderness welled within her. This man had saved her life, given her purpose when she'd lost everything, treated her with a respect George had never shown. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had fallen in love with him. The realization should have shocked her, but instead, it felt like recognizing something she'd known for weeks but hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Yet the recognition brought as much sorrow as joy. She was still married in the eyes of the law, abandoned but not free. And Gabe, for all his kindness, had never spoken of anything beyond their current arrangement. When spring came, their paths would likely diverge, she to rebuild her life elsewhere, he to continue his solitary existence on this remote ranch. The thought brought a physical pain that had nothing to do with her injured ankle. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having moved eastward overnight. Sunlight sparkled on the pristine blanket of snow covering the landscape, so bright it was almost painful to the eyes. Gabe rose early, checking on the animals before returning to examine Lillian's ankle. "Swelling's gone down," he noted, his fingers gentle as they unwrapped the bandage. "Try standing." With his support, Lillian carefully put weight on her foot. Pain flared, but less intensely than before. "I think I can manage if I'm careful," she said, determined to resume her duties despite his protests. They settled on a compromise. She would handle indoor tasks that allowed her to sit frequently, while he continued to manage anything requiring significant movement. The days that followed established a new rhythm, with Gabe remaining closer to the cabin than usual, finding reasons to check on her throughout the day. One afternoon, as February gave way to March and hints of approaching spring appeared in longer days and occasional thaws, Gabe returned from town with mail and supplies. Among the items was a newspaper from Phoenix, and as Lillian scanned its pages that evening, a small notice in the legal section caught her eye. "Oh," she exclaimed, sitting up straighter, Gabe looked up from the fence wire he was mending. Problem. Lillian read the notice again, hardly daring to believe it. It's about George. Apparently, he's filed for divorce in Tucson. The court is trying to locate me to respond. She looked up, a strange mixture of emotions churning within her. He's citing abandonment as grounds, claiming I left him. Gabe's expression darkened. Man's a liar as well as a coward. Yes, but Lillian shook her head, trying to sort through her feelings. Relief was predominant, the possibility of freedom from a marriage that had become a prison, but there was anger too at the audacity of George's lies. I need to respond, contest his false claims. We'll ride to town tomorrow, Gabe said decisively. Send a telegram to the court, set things straight. The "we" wasn't lost on Lillian, nor was the protective note in his voice. She nodded gratefully, the newspaper still clutched in her hands. The next day, they made the journey to Fort McDowell together, Lillian riding Gabe's gentlest mare while he walked alongside, unwilling to risk her ankle by having them both ride one horse. The town had changed little in the months since she'd last seen it, though it seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than it had the night George abandoned her. At the telegraph office, Gabe stood solid beside her as she composed a message to the Tucson court, stating her whereabouts and contesting George's version of events. The operator, a gossipy man with spectacles perched on his nose, barely concealed his interest in their business, but Gabe's stern glare discouraged any questions. As they prepared to leave town, a voice called out from the boardwalk of the general store. "Mrs. Whitaker, is that you?" Lillian turned to see the waitress from the hotel restaurant Eliza, she now recalled approaching with a friendly smile. "It is you. My goodness, we all wondered what happened after that terrible storm. Some folks thought you might have tried to follow your husband east." Eliza looked curiously at Gabe, who stood protectively near. "Mr. Blackett found me in the snow," Lillian explained. "I've been working at his ranch these past months." Eliza's eyebrows rose slightly. "How fortunate," she said, her tone suggesting she was drawing her own conclusions about their arrangement. "And Mr. Whitaker, any word?" "He's filed for divorce," Lillian said simply, seeing no reason to hide what would soon be public knowledge anyway. "Well," Eliza exclaimed, clearly storing this juicy information for later sharing. I'm sorry to hear it, though perhaps for the best, all things considered." Gabe shifted impatiently. "We should head back before dark," he said to Lillian, his tone making it clear he had little interest in prolonging the conversation. Lillian nodded, bidding Eliza goodbye. As they left town, she became uncomfortably aware of curious glances and whispered comments from other residents. By now, Eliza had likely shared her discovery with half the town. "They'll talk," she said quietly to Gabe as they passed the last buildings. "About me staying at your ranch, about us." Gabe's expression remained impassive. "People always talk, doesn't make what they say true." "But my reputation means nothing to those worth knowing," he interrupted firmly. "Besides, you're a woman working for wages, not." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with even mentioning the alternative arrangement some might assume. They completed the journey home in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Lillian, the day had brought a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. The prospect of divorce meant legal freedom, the chance to truly start anew. Yet it also removed the last barrier that had kept her from acknowledging her feelings for Gabe. She still had no idea if he reciprocated. March brought warming temperatures, and the first tentative signs of spring to the high desert. Patches of earth emerged from beneath melting snow, and birds returned from their winter migrations, filling the morning air with song. With the improvement in weather came increased activity. Cattle needed moving to fresh grazing areas. Winter damage required repair, and preparations began for the calving season ahead. Lillian's ankle healed completely, allowing her to resume her full duties and even take on new ones. Gabe taught her to ride properly, something George had never bothered with despite his promises of Western adventure. She proved a quick study, soon comfortable enough on horseback to accompany Gabe on shorter rides around the property. During one such ride in mid-March, they paused atop a small rise overlooking a valley where spring wildflowers had begun to carpet the ground in brilliant yellows and purples. The beauty of the scene struck Lillian with unexpected force after the monochromatic months of winter. "It's like the world is coming alive again," she marveled, drinking in the vibrant colors and the scent of warming earth. Gabe, sitting easy in his saddle beside her, nodded. "Best time of year out here, before the heat comes." Something in his tone made Lillian glance at him. His eyes were on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "Have you had any word from the court?" he asked, still not looking at her. "Not yet," she replied. "These things take time, I suppose." Gabe nodded again, seemingly absorbed in studying the landscape. "When it comes through the divorce, what then?" The question hung between them, freighted with unspoken implications. Lillian's heart quickened as she considered her answer. "I'm not certain," she said carefully. "I've been thinking about it a great deal." Now Gabe turned to look at her directly. "Could be opportunities in Phoenix. Bigger town, growing fast. Schools there would likely value a teacher with your experience." "Is that what you think I should do?" Lillian asked, searching his face for some indication of his true feelings. "Think you should do whatever brings you happiness," Gabe replied, his voice low. "You deserve that much, after everything." It wasn't the answer Lillian had hoped for, but there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability she'd never seen before that gave her courage. "And if what would bring me happiness is staying here?" she asked quietly. Gabe's breath seemed to catch. For a long moment he said nothing, and Lillian feared she had misread everything between them. Then he dismounted in a fluid motion and moved to stand beside her horse, looking up at her with an expression that made her heart leap. "Do you mean that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I've been trying to find the right words, the right moment. Trying to give you space to decide your own path without feeling obligated or pressured." Lillian slid from her saddle to stand before him, close enough to see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "I mean it. These months here, difficult as they began, have shown me what truly matters. What happiness actually looks like." She took a deep breath. "Who I want to build a life with if he'll have me." Gabe reached out, his weathered hand gentle as it brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Since that first night when I found you in the snow, something in me recognized something in you, like finding a piece I didn't know was missing." He hesitated, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "I've been alone a long time, Lillian, convinced myself it was better that way. Then you came, and suddenly the cabin wasn't just shelter anymore, it was becoming a home." Lillian's eyes filled with tears at the simple truth in his words. She reached up, covering his hand with her own where it rested against her cheek. "I love you," she said, the words finally spoken aloud after living in her heart for weeks. "I think I have almost since the beginning, though I tried not to." Gabe's smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude in an instant. "And I love you, Lillian Whitaker. More than I have words to tell you." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, then deepening with the release of long restrained emotion. Around them, the desert bloomed with new life, a fitting backdrop for the promise taking root between them. They returned to the ranch as the sun began its westward descent, both changed by the declarations they had finally voiced. That evening, as they sat by the fire that had warmed them through the winter, they spoke of practical matters, the need to wait for her divorce to be finalized before they could marry, plans for expanding the ranch with her help, dreams of perhaps adding a proper schoolroom to serve the children of neighboring ranches too distant from town for regular attendance. "I'm not a wealthy man," Gabe said as they discussed their future. "Ranch provides enough, but there's little extra. Life here won't be easy." Lillian smiled, thinking of the false promises George had made and the genuine happiness she'd found in this simple cabin with this honest man. "I don't need easy, I need real." April arrived with a letter from the Tucson court. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, with a final decree expected by early summer. George, it seemed, was eager to remarry a wealthy widow he'd met in St. Louis and had dropped his false claims of abandonment when faced with Lillian's evidence. Typical, Lillian remarked without bitterness as she read the letter. Always taking the easiest path. Gabe, working nearby on a new chair he was crafting for their expanding home, glanced up. His loss. My gain. The simple statement warmed Lillian more than any flowery declaration could have. In the weeks since their mutual confession of love, she had discovered the depth of feeling that lay beneath Gabe's reserved exterior. He expressed his affection not in grand gestures, but in consistent, thoughtful actions, expanding the garden plot when she mentioned enjoying fresh vegetables, riding into town for books he thought she might like, working from dawn until dusk to build additions to the cabin that would make it more comfortable for two. They maintained separate sleeping arrangements, both agreeing that propriety should be observed until her divorce was final, though their kisses had grown increasingly passionate as spring progressed. The waiting was difficult, but strengthened their relationship in unexpected ways, forcing them to build a foundation of communication and respect before physical intimacy. Word of their intention to marry once Lillian's divorce was finalized spread quickly through the scattered ranching community. To her surprise, the reaction was largely positive. It seemed Gabe was more respected than she had realized, his reputation for fair dealing and hard work earning him the goodwill of neighbors who might otherwise have judged their situation harshly. In late April, as the desert erupted in a spectacular but brief wildflower bloom following unusually heavy spring rains, Lillian received an unexpected visitor. She was hanging laundry in the warm sunshine when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn, shading her eyes against the glare. A woman on horseback approached, followed by a loaded pack mule. As she drew nearer, Lillian recognized Eliza from the hotel restaurant, her usual waitress uniform replaced by practical riding clothes. Mrs. Whitaker, Eliza called, waving as she dismounted. Or should I say the future Mrs. Blackett, according to what I hear, Lillian smiled, moving to greet her visitor. Just Lillian is fine. This is a surprise, Eliza. What brings you all this way? Eliza patted her horse's neck. Hotels closing new railroad lines bypassing Fort McDowell, and the town's drying up faster than a puddle in July. I'm headed to Phoenix to look for work, but I heard your place was on the way and thought I'd stop to say hello. She glanced around appreciatively. Nice spread you've got here. Lillian offered refreshments, and as they sat in the shade of a newly built porch, Eliza shared the latest town gossip. Most businesses were closing or relocating closer to the railroad, and many families had already departed. The news made Lillian grateful for the self-sufficient life she and Gabe were building, insulated from such economic shifts. Oh, almost forgot, Eliza exclaimed as she prepared to leave. Brought something for you. Wedding present, I suppose, though a bit early. From her pack, she extracted a carefully wrapped package. Inside, Lillian found a beautiful hand-pieced quilt in vibrant colors. Made it myself, Eliza said proudly. Every bride should have something nice for her home, even out here in the middle of nowhere. Deeply touched by the unexpected kindness, Lillian embraced her. It's beautiful. Thank you. After Eliza departed, continuing her journey to Phoenix, Lillian carefully spread the quilt across the bed that would soon be hers and Gabe's. The bright colors transformed the simple room, making it feel more like the home she had dreamed of. When Gabe returned that evening and saw the quilt, his response was characteristic: a slow, appreciative nod followed by practical action. By the next day, he had crafted a simple but elegant quilt rack to display it properly when not in use. May brought increasing heat and the final preparations for their wedding, planned for July immediately following the expected arrival of Lillian's divorce decree. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. The spring calving had gone well, with all but 2 of the new calves surviving, including the premature one they had nursed through the winter. Now a sturdy young bull that Gabe intended to keep for breeding. One scorching afternoon, as Lillian worked in the thriving vegetable garden, a cloud of dust on the distant road announced an approaching rider. Shading her eyes, she watched as the figure resolved into a man she didn't recognize, riding a fine horse and dressed in the style of an Eastern businessman, despite the heat. As the stranger approached, an uneasy feeling settled in Lillian's stomach. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain she had never met him before. "Madam," he called, removing his hat as he dismounted. "I'm looking for the Blackett Ranch. Would this be it?" "It is," Lillian confirmed, setting down her gardening tools. "Mr. Blackett is checking the north pasture but should return shortly. Can I help you with something?" The man studied her with open curiosity. "You would be Mrs. Whitaker then, Lillian Whitaker." Alarmed now, Lillian straightened. "I am, and you are, Lawrence Whitaker, George's brother." He smiled thinly. "I've come quite a long way to find you, sister-in-law." Shock rendered Lillian momentarily speechless. George had mentioned a brother in New York, a successful banker, but she had never met him during their brief marriage. "What brings you here, Mr. Whitaker?" She finally managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Lawrence's expression hardened slightly. "Family business, I'm afraid. My brother died 3 weeks ago in St. Louis, pneumonia, quite sudden." The news hit Lillian like a physical blow. George charming, irresponsible, selfish George dead. Despite everything, she felt a genuine pang of sorrow for the man she had once loved enough to marry. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely, "but I don't understand why you've come all this way to tell me in person." Lawrence reached into his jacket and withdrew an official-looking document. "Because of this, George's will, it seems he never completed your divorce proceedings. Legally, you remain his widow and heir to his estate." Lillian stared at the document, uncomprehending. "Estate? George left with our savings. He had nothing." A bitter laugh escaped Lawrence. "That's what he wanted you to believe, apparently. The truth is considerably more complex." He gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere cooler. It's a rather lengthy explanation." Still dazed, Lillian led him to the cabin. As she prepared coffee, Lawrence explained the situation in the precise tones of the banker he was. George, it seemed, had been embezzling funds from his employers for years, investing the money in railroad stocks that had recently soared in value. Upon his death, the fraudulent activities had been discovered, but so had legitimate investments worth a considerable fortune. After restitution to the defrauded parties, there remains approximately $20,000, Lawrence concluded. As his legal widow, it belongs to you. The amount was staggering more money than Lillian had ever imagined possessing. Her mind raced with possibilities, but one thought predominated. The ranch improvements she and Gabe had been planning, but couldn't afford expanded cattle herds, better breeding stock, perhaps even hiring help. "There is, however, a complication," Lawrence continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I've been authorized to offer you $5,000 to renounce all claims to George's estate. The remaining funds would then revert to his mother, who is in precarious health and needs proper care." Lillian's eyes narrowed. "And if I decline this offer, then things become difficult. The companies George defrauded are prepared to bring civil suits against his estate and, by extension, against you as his widow. Legal proceedings could tie up the entire amount for years, during which you would have access to nothing." The threat was clear, and Lillian felt a surge of anger at the familiar tactics. Even from beyond the grave, George was manipulating her. "I need time to consider," she said firmly. "And to discuss this with Mr. Blackett." Lawrence's gaze sharpened with interest. "Ah yes, your employer, the man you've been living with these past months. I made inquiries in town, you see. Rather unusual arrangement for a married woman, wasn't it?" The implication in his tone made Lillian's cheeks burn. "Mr. Blackett saved my life when your brother abandoned me to freeze to death. Our relationship has been entirely proper." Of course, Lawrence said smoothly, though his expression suggested otherwise. I merely point out that such irregularities might interest a judge should matters proceed to court. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Moments later, Gabe entered, stopping short at the sight of their visitor. Introductions were made with cool formality, and Lillian quickly explained Lawrence's presence and the shocking news he brought. Gabe listened without comment, his expression unreadable, though Lillian noted the tension in his jaw. So you see, Mr. Blackett, Lawrence concluded, Mrs. Whitaker has some important decisions to make. Perhaps it would be best if I returned tomorrow after you've had time to discuss matters privately. We'd appreciate that, Gabe replied evenly. You'll find accommodations in Fort McDowell. After Lawrence departed, promising to return the following afternoon, silence fell between Lillian and Gabe. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. $20,000 would change your life. Open doors that staying here would close forever. Lillian studied his face, reading the fear he was trying to conceal, fear that this unexpected development would alter everything between them. It's blood money, she said quietly, stolen from others. The restitution's been made, according to his brother. What's left is legally yours. And comes with strings attached, not least Lawrence's thinly veiled threats about our relationship. Lillian moved closer to Gabe, needing to bridge the sudden distance between them. What would you do if it were your decision? Gabe was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the window where dust from Lawrence's departure still hung in the air. Take the 5,000, he said finally. It's still more money than most see in a lifetime, enough to build something solid here if that's still what you want. The qualifier at the end of his statement revealed his uncertainty. Lillian reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It is what I want, you are what I want. She squeezed his hand. The money changes nothing about that. Relief flickered across Gabe's face, quickly replaced by his usual reserve. Sleep on it, he advised. Decision this big shouldn't be made in haste. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues, Lillian found clarity. George's final manipulative act from beyond the grave would not determine her future. The path she had chosen with Gabe, a life built on honest work and genuine love, was worth more than any fortune tainted by deceit. When Lawrence returned the next day, she was ready with her answer. I'll accept the $5,000 and renounce further claims, she told him, her voice steady. On one condition, the money is transferred immediately without delay. Lawrence studied her thoughtfully. You surprise me, Mrs. Whitaker. I expected more resistance. I've had my fill of fighting, Mr. Whitaker. Besides, she added with a glance at Gabe, who stood solid and supportive beside her, I have everything I truly need right here. The necessary paperwork was completed that very day, with Lawrence producing documents he had brought in anticipation of her eventual agreement. By sunset, he was gone, leaving behind a bank draft that would change their lives while allowing them to remain true to the values they shared. That evening, as they sat before the fire discussing plans for the future, a larger barn, better breeding stock, perhaps even a proper house, eventually Lillian felt a profound sense of peace. The money would make their lives easier, but it wasn't the foundation of their happiness. That had been built through shared struggle, mutual respect, and a love that had grown naturally from the harshest of beginnings. No regrets, Gabe asked quietly, studying her face in the firelight. Lillian shook her head. Not one. George offered grand promises but delivered only lies. You offered nothing but honesty and gave me everything that matters. July arrived with scorching heat, and the long-awaited letter from Tucson, not the divorce decree they had expected, but confirmation that Lillian's widowhood was now legally recognized, freeing her to remarry whenever she chose. Their wedding took place on the ranch the following Saturday, a simple ceremony performed by a traveling minister who served the scattered communities of the territory. Neighbors from surrounding ranches gathered to witness their vows. the women bringing food for a celebration afterward, the men arriving with practical gifts for the newly expanded ranch. Lillian wore a dress of pale blue cotton, ordered from Phoenix with part of her inheritance and wildflowers in her hair. Gabe, uncommonly handsome in a new shirt and polished boots, stumbled slightly over his vows, his usual composure undone by emotion and the significance of the moment. "I, Gabriel James Blackett, take you, Lillian Marie Whitaker, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady despite the moisture gathering in his eyes. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death parts us. I, Lillian Marie Whitaker, take you, Gabriel James Blackett, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she responded, her heart so full it seemed impossible that her voice could remain steady. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death parts us." As they exchanged simple gold bands, Lillian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment from the night Gabe found her freezing in the snow to this sun-drenched day when they pledged their lives to each other before witnesses. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Gabe's kiss was tender but confident, a promise of the life they would build together. Around them, their neighbors applauded, genuinely happy for the union of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music provided by a neighbor's fiddle and another's harmonica. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the land that was now truly their shared home, Lillian and Gabe slipped away from the festivities to stand together on the rise overlooking their property. "Happy?" Gabe asked, his arm around her waist drawing her close against his side. Lillian leaned into him, savoring the solid strength of him, the certainty of his presence in her life. "Completely." Later that night, when their guests had departed and they were finally alone, they came together as husband and wife with a tenderness born of long anticipation. Gabe's hands, so capable in all they did, were gentle as they undressed her, his eyes full of wonder and desire. Lillian, freed from the constraints of propriety at last, welcomed him with all the love that had grown in her heart through the months of waiting. Their lovemaking was a natural extension of the bond they had built, honest, unguarded, and deeply satisfying. Afterward, lying in each other's arms beneath Eliza's colorful quilt, they spoke softly of their hopes for the future. "Never thought I'd have this," Gabe admitted, his finger tracing idle patterns on Lillian's bare shoulder. "A wife, a real home, always figured I'd live and die alone on this land. And I never imagined finding such happiness after George's betrayal," Lillian replied. "When you found me in the snow that night, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was just beginning." The years that followed proved the truth of those words. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, gradually expanding as they invested Lillian's inheritance wisely in improvements and additional land. Within 2 years, they had built a proper house, not grand, but comfortable, with a wide porch where they could sit together and watch the desert sunsets. Their first child, a son they named Thomas, arrived in the spring of 1890, bringing new joy to their lives. Strong and healthy like his father, with his mother's thoughtful nature, he grew quickly in the freedom of ranch life. When Lillian discovered she was expecting their second child in 1892, she and Gabe decided it was time to fulfill another dream. Using part of the remaining inheritance, they built a small schoolhouse on their property and invited neighboring families to send their children. Lillian taught 3 days a week, balancing her love of education with the demands of ranch life and motherhood. Their daughter, Margaret, born in the winter of 1893, inherited her father's piercing blue eyes and her mother's determination. From her earliest days, she showed a special affinity for horses, often found in the stable with Gabe even before she could walk steadily. Life was not without challenges. Drought years tested their resilience, and the changing economy of the West brought new complications as the century drew to a close. Yet through it all, the foundation they had built first in that small cabin through a harsh winter, then in the larger home that grew with their family, remained unshaken. On cold winter nights, they sometimes told their children the story of how they met, how Gabe had found Lillian freezing in the snow and brought her to his fire. The children loved the tale, especially when their father described riding through the blizzard with their mother held tightly in his arms. It was fate, Margaret would declare dramatically, always the romantic of the family. It was good luck, Thomas would counter, practical like his father. Gabe and Lillian would exchange smiles over their children's heads, knowing it had been something more profound than either fate or luck, a recognition between two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, precisely when they needed it most. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Gabe surprised Lillian with a special gift, a small silver locket containing a tiny portrait of their family, and pressed beneath glass on the opposite side, a sprig of the wildflowers that had carpeted the desert the day they first confessed their love. "To remind you," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "that even in the coldest winter, spring always comes again." Lillian touched the locket, then reached up to trace the lines that time and sun had etched more deeply around his eyes, lines of laughter and concentration, of worry during hard times and joy in the good. In his face, she still saw the man who had carried her through the snow a decade earlier, but also the husband and father he had become, the partner who had walked beside her through all the seasons of their life together. "I need no reminder," she said softly. "I have you." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, their children's laughter drifting from inside, Lillian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. From the bitter cold of abandonment to the warmth of true partnership, from the isolation of a snowstorm to the rich connections of family and community, they had traveled farther than any physical distance could measure. The setting sun painted the desert in the same fiery colors it had that first winter, when Gabe had found her and brought her to his fire. But now, instead of representing danger and the fight for survival, those colors symbolized the warmth at the heart of their shared life, a warmth that had begun with a single act of kindness and grown into a love that would sustain them through all the winters and summers to come.